We're talking about the 7 hacks that leaders use to establish trust in their teams. It's important for me to distinguish the difference between virtual teams and on-site or physical teams. Everything that I'm talking about will actually work for all teams, but it's designed for virtual teams. And we will get into the details of what trust is, why it's important, and how to manage virtual resources. So why is the time now? Well, I think if you're in here, you're already leading virtual teams or virtual resources. So by a show of hands, how many of you have virtual employees, virtual resources? Leave your hand up. If you don't have a virtual resource, could you raise your hand? And how many of you will not raise your hand no matter what I ask? Okay. By a show of hands, how many of you are using WebEx or have used Zoom, Skype, GoToMeeting? Great. So the reason why the time's now is because you're already leading virtual resources. And I'm not sure when the last time was that you actually had a conversation about trust and establishing trust in your team with those virtual resources. Why should you listen to me? Well, a couple key facts. I've spent over 5 years conducting research on how teams perform when trust is present and when trust is not present. And I've interviewed and studied about a little bit more than 500 employees, teams, soldiers, musicians, on how their team performs when trust is present and trust is not present, including their leaders. Successful leaders, and regrettably, even leaders who have failed. Why is trust so important? It's the #1 cause of failure for teams and their leaders. So there are multiple causes to failure for leaders and their teams, but the #1 cause of failure, when you research the cause, it's the #1 cause. And it's duplicitous because trust is unique, because it's also the #1 cause of success. It's the #1 cause of failure. It's the only variable that can be tested that sits on both sides of the pendulum. Why is trust so important? Qualitatively, employee satisfaction, creativity, performance are directly correlated to organizational trust. But quantitatively, we know that if we're looking for a resource and we're in Houston, if we need someone in Austin, in Singapore or San Francisco, it's a lot easier to find them where they are than to bring them to Houston, Texas. So there's a reduction in travel, a reduction in real estate, a reduction in recruiting cost, an increase in productivity, efficiency, improved decision-making, increased competitiveness, and innovation. From sports teams to music bands to military troops, teams with high trust are teams that perform on a high level. Again, trust is correlated to the #1 cause of failure and the #1 cause of success. Is anyone familiar with what this chart is? 5 dysfunctions of a team. Here's a guy who leads teams. I love it. This is Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. It was an instant classic book. Patrick Lencioni is an academic who did research on trust. He did it on trust in traditional on-site teams, but it applies to all teams. And what he noted that a lot of people don't understand in this, who are not researchers who have read his work, the work behind his work, is that this is a stepladder, which means that if you want this, it's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team is a great book, and I recommend you read it. What's exciting about what he wrote and what he found in his research is that, he wrote it from a parable standpoint, absence of trust would mean that's a dysfunction. So if you want to have a healthy team, you would need a healthy amount of trust. You need a healthy amount of conflict, commitment. Attention to results is the pinnacle, which is what everybody who has a team is interested in. And again, this doesn't matter if you're coaching softball or you're coaching a team of international engineers or virtually dispersed engineers, it doesn't matter. We're all interested in results, except what Lencioni pointed out, which is critical for our conversation today, is that you can't make it to the next level in the pyramid unless the first level is covered. So if you have a team that lacks any level of baseline trust, you'll never get to healthy conflict, which will never get you to standardized commitment, which will lead you to never getting results. Now you can see why this is the #1 cause of team failure and leader failure of virtual teams or of teams in general. It's because they can never get to the results if there's an absence of trust. Can you raise your hand if you're following me so far? Just raise your hand. Okay. Thanks. When trust is missing, it's an important note here for me to tell you that the #1 aggravation for leaders is that your resources end up acting defensively. I'll highlight a couple other things, but the #1 action that they take, you'll see it in their results and you'll see it in their attitude, but most importantly, in their personality, but most importantly, they act defensively and they spend a lot of their time working defensively. But virtual teams and trust, obviously, as you know, it's not Skittles and rainbows. managing a virtual team of virtual resources, it is more difficult. We'll talk about the 7 hacks that will help you establish trust in those teams. Why is it more difficult? Well, you have poor team identification, poor communication, low engagement, isolation, ineffective management or leadership perhaps, and sporadic or even failing performance. But here's a cautionary tale. Who knows what this is?
It's a video doorbell.
Excuse me?
Video doorbell.
Very close. In 2013, Jamie Siminoff appeared on ABC's Shark Tank. When he did, the Sharks had spent all day watching pitches, and they watched and listened to all the pitches the same way, perhaps the same way you're listening to me. And when Jamie Siminoff told them that he was presenting something, a technology that was improving something that had not been updated or improved or seen any innovation in almost 100 years, the Sharks were interested. Their interest was piqued. But when he explained a little bit more, there was nothing wrong with his evaluation, nothing wrong with his experience and his innovations. They passed on what is now known as Doorbot. Very close. It became Ring within only months after the conclusion of the show and sold to Amazon for $1 billion a few years later. Still the single largest mishap of the Sharks. So in this scenario, I'm Jamie Siminoff, and I'm sorry? In this scenario, well, to be continued. And I was just at like the main point. Michael, come on. In this scenario, I'm Jamie Siminoff, and you're the Sharks. And you want to make sure that you listen to the conversation about trust in a uniquely different way. You don't want to hear it like, I trust you, or trust me, or trust this. You want to understand how critical it is and how much the research has shown it is critical to team performance. So what is trust? Academically, trust describes a state of perception that exists when members of a team are susceptible to the actions of others based on their vulnerability to them and the belief that others will sorry, that's Oliver. He keeps us on track. From the top, describes a state of or perception that exists when members of a team are susceptible to the actions of others based on their vulnerability to the team and the belief that others will perform and act in a way that is expected. Trust is perception. There are 2 types of trust, and from an academic standpoint and a practical standpoint, you want to know this because I would assert that by majority, if you're like most of the leaders that have been studied, they are only using one type of trust. This isn't even one of the hacks. This is a freebie that you should consider using the second type of trust. The first type is what's called cognition-based trust. It's cognitive, it's rational, it's logical. It deals with your team members' perceptions of your and their perception of competence, reliability, integrity, and responsibility. This is very common in workplace environments. It's the one that most leaders go to first, especially engineers, I would assert. Number 2, the second type of organizational trust is something called affect-based trust. And it's the one that's a little bit more difficult to poke your finger on, but we all know it when we feel it and see it. It's the emotional aspect of trust, but it deals with perceptions of confidence, empathy, and concern. It deals with emotional security that your team members feel in working with you. When you're working with virtual resources like we all do, it's easier to work on the rational logical trust, and it's more complicated to obviously impact the emotional trust. Global versus domestic virtual teams. I don't know if any of you are using global resources, and maybe some of you are only using domestic. This talk is focused on domestic, but again, it does work for all types of leadership situations. Thomas Friedman, when he wrote "The World is Flat," he was right, but I don't think he realized how flat it was and how fast it was going to become that flat. Here are the 3 big issues for dealing with global virtual teams that I think most of you already know instinctively. It's going to be a cultural issue, a spatial issue, or a temporal issue. But here's something you may have never languaged before. In dealing with global resources, your expectation and their expectation is very, very low. You already know there are going to be difficulties. But with a domestically dispersed resource, someone that's, say, in Austin or California, you can even have a remote resource in Houston. If you're not co-located, they can be in Houston if they're ever coming to your office, if you're from here. The problem with the number 1 problem cited for domestic virtual resources is that they have very, very high expectations. They believe that it's going to be just like where they just were. You're going to be just like their last boss. You're going to understand all their little nuances. So there are little nuanced issues with organizational culture that have to be addressed. The 7 hacks leaders use to build trust, specifically in virtually dispersed domestic virtual teams. By the way, when I first sent this over to PIP, I wrote the title of the presentation, this was an accident, or was it? 7 hacks business leaders use to establish trust in domestically disturbed virtual teams. Thank goodness I caught that before she published that. Okay, number 1, virtual leadership. We'll dig into each one of these. Number 2, social comparisons. Number 3, virtual water cooler. Number 4, swift trust. Number 5, co-presence. Number 6, interdependence. And number 7, inceptions. Number 1, virtual leadership. Virtual leadership is important to distinguish between traditional leadership. Traditional leadership, you know that. I assert that's why you're here, and you're trying to develop yourself in that area. But virtual leadership is sometimes referred to as e-leadership, and it's different. You have to actually revise your face-to-face strategies because your ability to sense if I'm upset and I'm on your team has gone out the window if you never see me walk down the hallway or you never see me get a cup of coffee. What most leaders do is that they don't revise these strategies and they try to actually lay their traditional strategy of managing and leading resources on site to the same that they use for virtual, and therefore they struggle with establishing trust in their teams. Here's the 3 areas. If you manage a virtual resource, you have to mediate interaction, communication, and behaviors. It is more difficult to manage virtual resources, and the 3 areas you want to focus on is the actual interaction, and we're going to dig into all 3 of these actually in the other hacks, communication and behaviors. And last but not least, for virtual leadership, I'm encouraging you to provide what's called direct leadership substitutes. You need a middleman because most teams are cited when there's an issue with trust, it's that they have no one else they can go to when they need work done. So a direct leadership substitute, either a team head or team leader, is really critical. If you're a very flat organization or a very flat team, you should consider promoting someone to some sort of position where other people on the team can see them as a resource. Number 2, social comparisons. This is a fun one. Because if you really are competitive in driving performance on your team, you're probably very familiar with upward social comparisons. Upward social comparisons involve if Dennis is doing a really good job and Matthew's my leader, Matthew says, Stephen, get your stuff together, Dennis is doing a great job. In traditional teams, that works very well because I get motivated. I can do what Dennis is doing. I mean, come on, I got to get it together. This is very traditional. It's a very traditional way of comparing people to get motivation from the bottom up. Except it doesn't work in virtual teams. In fact, it has a negative effect because I don't know Dennis and I can't see Dennis. I am left to imagine who Dennis is and all of his characteristics and how he was born, pedigree, how he is the grandson or nephew of somebody who runs the company, and all that's left to me, and it has a negative effect on establishing trust. Here's what does work in virtual teams, and this is a really, really awesome hack. It does work. It's what's called downward social comparisons. Now, if Matthew said, hey, don't tell anybody, but Dennis really has been stinking on his job. You're so much better than him. If you can give him a helping hand, he'd really appreciate it. What that does for me is that it makes me know that Matthew believes in me as a person on his team. And it's not, obviously, we wouldn't promote saying something negative that's not true about Dennis, but downward social comparisons do work in establishing trust in teams. It's simple. Here's the hack. It's about acknowledging and affirming team members' contribution. We all know that, but you want to do it in a downward, not an upward social comparison. Hack number 3, virtual water cooler. This is fun. I guess this is what your fun face looks like, I guess. But for me, this is really fun. You want to encourage non-work-related communication. Of all the research done, having your teammates and your colleagues connect on social media. I know you were just in a branding. Hold on. Sociable, knowable, and referable? Okay, I got the general gist of it, right? So having your teammates or your resources, your employees or your contractors be on social media together is a powerful tool in creating water cooler talk, virtual water cooler talk. You want to believe this works so effectively. There's so many teams that we've studied, including parts of the military that do virtual celebrations with their resources when they're in remote spots with birthdays and anniversaries. And Virtual happy hour, there's a group that on Fridays that we studied that actually they all, in their Zoom meeting, they actually share a beer together in their office in a virtual happy hour, or anytime they complete a project or complete a project milestone. Not encouraging you to tell your employees to drink on the job, but I am encouraging you to consider a virtual happy hour. Maybe you could do tea if you don't want to do beer. Swift Trust, this is very practical. Swift Trust is fast forming. It's important when it's best in temporary settings because it relies heavily on what I called earlier CBT, or cognition-based trust, where it's the logical trust. It's a very powerful tool to get people to merge together to get results fast. If you don't know you're going to be in a temporary setting and you try to use techniques on a team if you use techniques that you've used in physical settings, meaning you were co-located like we are today, if you use that in a virtual team where you need Swift Trust, you will miss the mark. Do you want me to say it again? Yes. Yeah, it's important at the end of the day for you, and you had like caramelized popcorn. If you are a leader of on-site or co-located teams, and you're used to leading that team for a long period of time, and then you suddenly get virtual resources, so not co-located, and you're going to be with them for a short time frame, or you need a very quick result, if you manage that team like you manage their team, you will fail, the research says. You will not hit the target. You'll revise and ask for forgiveness from whoever you're reporting to or whatever team's waiting for you. There is something called Swift Trust, and it is designed in virtual resources, in virtual settings. It's best in temporary settings. The trust is cognitive. It's not effect-based. It has nothing to do with emotion. It's all about results and about integrity and responsibility. And it's pretty simple. It's about early, positive, and continuous communication. That sounds obvious, except we're not used to providing early communication, great, but continuous and positive, we're not. If you have a virtual resource and you have a short-term goal, the easiest thing you can do to achieve that goal is to actually give them very positive, leave the negative behind. You don't have time to clean it up. You telling them where they should correct and telling them how they should be a better this or a worse that is not going to help you. Telling them where positive and continuous communication will benefit them, and it'll benefit you. The fifth hack, co-presence. This is a fun one. We're now shifting a little bit into ABT with this one. Co-presence is the psychological perception of co-location. If Dennis and I see each other every day, it's one thing. But if Dennis and I are in two different buildings, and I don't ever see him, but we're in essence on the same site, there's an opportunity to actually consider me or him a virtual resource to the company. But there's also the ability to create co-presence. And co-presence is a psychological perception. It's not real. It's a perception, but it does have major benefits. It requires consistent and frequent communication, because if Dennis and I were in the same office together and I passed him every couple of days, we'd say hello. What's up? How was your weekend? Did you watch the Rockets or did you watch Golden State? What are you doing this weekend? This frequent communication creates the perception of co-location. Real-time tracking of team member activities, if you want to implement this, it has really long-lasting positive benefits. It is the ability for me to know what Dennis is working on, even if it's meaningless to my project, but I know what he's working on because I can look in the system and see it. If where I'm going to look for my tracking, if I can see his tracking, a lot of companies and a lot of groups will isolate themselves from the other team members. In virtual resources, that's a negative, that's not positive. You actually want to keep the information fluid to create this sense of co-presence. It creates a sense of connection and of trust. And this is the essence of the hack. The companies that we've seen do this have been the teams that we've seen do this, not companies, teams, have been the most successful, where they use avatars, nicknames, and photos on internal communication. So there's actually an avatar of Dennis, there's a photo of me, so he actually sees me. It creates a sense of co-location. It's a psychological impact. Hack number 6, nurturing interdependence. Interdependence. It's the unavoidable dependence on another's knowledge and skill. You already know this. But there's a temptation with the virtual resources to not have a reliance on interdependence because you may not have a lot of confidence in a particular resource that you have. You want to nurture interdependence by making sure that the people on your team know how their role or job and responsibility is important to them, to the rest of the virtual team, but to who else? Oh, you weren't expecting a question. I've just been giving you the information. To the entire organization. You as a leader, it's important, and to their team it's important, and to them it's important. But it's showing them how their work is related to and important to the entire organization is critical. It's an essential function in virtual team success. It's the only, just to be clear. Whoops. Nope. That was awesome. Thank you. Well, I have one. I don't know why. There we go. I only use the word essential function once, and for a reason here. It's because nurturing interdependence is an essential function for virtual team performance. Fostered in the workflow design and organizational chart, you can reorganize your chart to show them how their work is at play, and shared information and goals. I think you already know that. And lastly, it creates a sense of teamwork and connection. The last hack is what's called inceptions. Here, this might make you pay attention to this one. It's the 7th one. It's the last one. 70% of leaders who fail leading virtual teams don't have an inception process at all. So those of you who raised your hand that said that you have virtual teams, you might be interested to know that 70% of the team leaders of virtual resources that fail do not have this in their repertoire at all. So what's an inception? I think you know what it is but it's an onboarding process that's beyond HR. It's a welcoming to the team. It's a new employees meet the team. It's simple and easy. You do it with personal stories. If you've not heard of the 3Fs, family, or the Ford acronym, F-O-R-D, tell me about your friends, tell me about your past occupation or jobs, tell me about your recreation, tell me about your dreams. There's all sorts of acronyms to do this, but it relates to personal stories. That 70% there is a reminder of the one I just gave you. It establishes trust early. It is simple. The fact that more people don't do it is really interesting. You can do it at kickoff for your product launch. And the tool that we've seen used the most is creating the buddy system, where the two buddies get together. You can have a buddy system in virtual team settings. If you're not using that, I highly recommend that you do. Trust is built like a wall, brick by brick, layer by layer. The mortar in the wall is trust. And if you establish trust early, in this scenario, the wall stays. If you don't, the wall collapses. This is the wheel of trust. This is a chance for you to check back in. This is the 7 hacks, so hopefully you were paying attention. You can actually look at this. You don't have to keep it face down. Thank you. Yes, sir. We're going to do this exercise together. This is an exercise. I like that watch. This is an exercise. Thank you. You're going to read, anyone need one? 2 more? You got it? Several more. Here we go. There we go. Thank you. Anyone else? You're just going to read the 7 hacks, and you're going to rate yourself from 1 to 7. 7's the best. 1 is not the best. I encourage intellectual honesty. Call your mother if you want to be lied to. Intellectual honesty. 1 is the worst, 7's the best. It may look something like this. Here's an example of what it should look like. You're going to put a dot. If you have never distinguished your style of virtual leadership versus traditional leadership, you may be a 1 or a 2, right? Or social comparisons, you may actually you don't use that very often, but when you do, you only use it in a positive way for people that are below, not above. Virtual, it's going to look like this. When you're done, something like this. You rate yourself. What's the number one failure? This is not a rhetorical question. What's the number one failure of leaders? Virtual teams. What regarding trust? It's not a. It's really. I'm curious if you know. You don't know. It's that, and it's really interesting. It's that leaders of virtual teams, the number one cause of failure when you examine it again from looking at all sorts of different types of teams, the number one cause of failure is actually related to leaders of virtual resources never taking training or resources or coaching or education about how to manage virtual resources. Did any of you, just as a curiosity, just for my own informal research, a lot of you raised your hand, probably 75% of you raised your hand earlier when I said you're already managing virtual resources. Before you manage them, did you engage in any sort of virtual team leadership training? Okay, one or two of you. Okay, cool. So there you have it, right? Well, you have done one, because we just did one. So you can high five your neighbor. You can high five your neighbor. High five your neighbor. You need it. Trust me, you need the engagement. You guys are on caramel popcorn. High five your neighbor that you've completed at least one training on virtual resources. Number one, success. What do you think the number one success is in virtual leaders who manage virtual teams? What's the technique or tool? Say again? Establishing trust? What's the tool that I meant for establishing that? It's not on your list. It's one that you want to know about because I don't want you to think that I'm not about results. In fact, if you know anything about me personally, you know that's all I'm about is results, as a matter of fact. I'm about everything that comes after that, but results are critically important. You know, people are part of the results, but I want to get results in anything I'm up to. You're close, but you went soft on me. You guys are all getting soft. Now imagine you need to come on. Sticking to deadlines. Setting and sticking to deadlines is the number one tool used by leaders who have successful teams once they've established trust. Setting and sticking to deadlines, not wavering on the deadlines. It's the number one tool used. Well, if you don't have trust established, you can't do that. So some of you who are finding it difficult to actually do that in your teams, I can't tell you for sure if this is it without knowing more, but I can tell you if you are having a constant difficulty of setting and sticking to deadlines where your team meets the deadlines, assuming the deadlines are realistic, your issue is probably related to trust, actually. Though what's the number one myth?
Face-to-face is always better.
Close, but not it. And it involves this topic. The number one myth of virtual teams is that you can have sustained success without trust. You cannot have sustained success on any type of team without trust. That's how critical it is. And it's taken for granted in many cases. All right. Number one tool used by women that men don't. Huh? What was that? I didn't hear what you said. I didn't hear what you said. Huh? Just kidding. So understanding intent and tone in paraverbal or nonverbal communications is extremely difficult. Email, text, chat, it's very difficult. So that's the hint. This is from a ton of research. It's a tool that almost no men use and almost all women use. Almost, not all. Huh? Emojis, emoticons. Yes, great job. Do you use them? Yeah. Statistically, it's a super majority of women, and it's a super minority of men who use them. And in fact, it is such an easy tool. If I'm talking to the men right now, we associate with that we'd rather be direct so that the communication's not misinterpreted. But we think that we're being efficient. But instead, we're leaving too much of the tone left to be interpreted. Our female counterparts are doing the exact same communication. But there is a huge difference between which one of these comes with the message. And they can very easily be very direct in the communication and get their point across, but convey the tone and the context with one simple click of their mouse or their finger, thumb. Okay. (1940). It's Walter and Grace Lance. They get married. They don't want to have a traditional honeymoon. They decide to go to the backwoods of California, and they're going to stay in a log cabin. Very first night of their honeymoon, they're going to sleep, and there's a bird pecking all over their wood cabin. He's really upset. He wants to get up and he wants to shoot. He brought a gun. He wants to shoot the bird. But she says no. Next night it happens again. They didn't get any sleep and they're really aggravated with each other. Third night it starts to rain in their cabin. And little did they know that the bird had been actually poking holes in the roof of the cabin, so it's leaking in the cabin now. So they've got no sleep for 2 days. It's the third night. They're really frustrated. They actually get up in the middle of the night to leave the honeymoon, very frustrated with each other, to drive back to the city. They get in the car, and they stop at the end of the driveway where this log cabin was, and they agree that they're going to tell everybody that this honeymoon was a success. They weren't sure how they were going to do it. And from the drive from the log cabin all the way back to their house, they developed the story of Woody the Woodpecker, one of the most famous cartoons in the world. And it's a fascinating story that explains, to me, it's a great parable. It explains that you may not control the circumstance, but you definitely control your reaction. And it relates to managing virtual teams because you don't have control over where they are in the circumstances that they're working in. Wind or the sails? Which one gives a ship its direction? Is it the wind or the sails? If you say the wind, you have to ask yourself, well, how is it that 3 boats in the same water dealing with the same wind could all be heading in 3 different directions? In fact, it is the sails, thank you, that give the boat its directions. And in managing virtual resources, I want to encourage you to remember that you can't control the winds. In fact, there are more difficult headwinds in virtual teams than there are in traditional teams, except you control the sails. And the number one sail you have, actually, and your number one go-to resource is trust. Everything we've been talking about today is top-down versus bottom-up. So leader to team, boss to employee, coach to player, commander to the soldier. But don't you want to know what it's like from them up to you? Yeah, it's interesting. What's their perspective? So I'm not going to tell you all the research on their perspective up, but it is fascinating. I know if I told you some of it, you just explain it away or recontextualize it anyway. But here's a great analogy for what it's like and what they're looking for on a team where they have a leader who's managing them to establish virtual trust. How many of you have flown on an airplane in the last 6 months by a show of hands? Last 6 months? Flown on an airplane. Flown on an airplane. Okay, if you had your hand up, did any of you ask the pilot for his resume? Or how many flights he had taken in the last 12 months? Or if this was his first day on the job? Or if he'd been drinking or doing drugs? Or he wrote a suicide note before he entered the plane? None of you asked that. If you've had a surgery recently, you don't have to raise your hand. But if you've had a surgery recently, you had a heart surgery, a knee surgery, a shoulder surgery, why is it that when we're having a heart surgery, we ask the doctor, can we have a second opinion or a third opinion? We go to see online if they've had any negative reviews or any complaints. We call the health board. We ask all of our family friends. Why do we check all of that? The reason why we check all of that is because if you have a heart doctor and he doesn't do a good job in his role, he gets up from the table and goes home to his family, and you're left there hopefully to leave later that day, hopefully, or not at all. He's not in it with you. But we know from when we're riding on an airplane that the pilot is absolutely in it with you. If he does a bad job, we all go down, right? He's in it all the way to the end. So we don't need to listen to him for 30 seconds telling us about what time we're going to land, what direction. We don't want to listen to any of that because we know they're in it with us to win. If you want to know what it's like to have top-down, or bottom-up rather, perspective, your resources are looking for you to be a pilot. They're not looking for you to be a heart doctor. Lastly, I was looking for some image that I could convey what it's like to convey trust. What's the gap that maybe you could fill? Something that you might remember. And so I came up with this. To paraphrase Ernest Hemingway, the best way to establish trust with your team is to trust them. And the biggest opportunity for you with your virtual resources is to actually start giving a little bit more heart, a little bit more emotional trust. It's just as much rational, logical trust, that's all great, but introducing a little bit more heart in the process. That concludes my talk.